Oh, I've got this. I don't need this. All right, excellent. Double mic'd. So I'm J.R. Storment from Cloudability, Bhupendra Hirani from YouView. I want to give you guys a little warning. Our illustrious host, Ijaz, asked us right before the presentation to make it interactive, and it previously was not interactive, so we've just rearranged all of our slides from two groups into a mixed group. So you're going to see it hot off the presses. We may have some back and forth, so you can give us some cheers or boos if you need along the way. So today we're going to talk a little bit about a different side of AWS and cloud that I think happens at a lot of these meetups, which is the financial and economic side, specifically how YouView manages their spending in AWS and optimizes along the way. So by way of introduction.
Hi there, so I'm Bhupendra. So I've been at YouView for just over 4 years. And started off as a capacity manager, but now I'm looking after the optimization manager, so responsible for costs on our cloud platforms. And I'll talk a bit more about what YouView does on the next slide.
So I'm J.R. Storment. I'm co-founder of Cloudability. Just moved to the UK about 9 months ago. Apologies for my accent, still working on it. Been in the cloud space for about 7 years, building and optimizing on AWS. Wrote a book recently on this whole sort of cloud financial management space, and we're a platform that helps with cloud spend optimization visibility. So our contact details are up there, and we'll dive in.
Cool. So first of all, just a bit about YouView. So it's a B2B brand, so some of you may not be familiar with it. Started off in 2012 as a hybrid TV platform, and it's a joint venture taking some of the biggest telecoms and content providers. So we've got BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, BT, TalkTalk, and Arqiva as the equal shareholders. So through our TV platform, through BT TV and TalkTalk TV, as well as being integrated into Sony TVs, we've got a reach of 3 million homes. As well as the TV experience, we've got a companion app, and recently we've been trialing the voice-activated interaction with your TV. And so most of the story is about we underwent a big transformation at the tail end of 2016, where we revamped the whole platform, changed the UI on the set-top box, and we sort of went cloud first. So using the cloud to make changes a lot faster to support the changing needs of our viewers, our partners, and advertisers. So as part of that program, we had a lot of cultural change. So moved into all the buzzwords, so DevOps, Agile, and started using a lot more of the cloud services in the way that they're meant to be used rather than the initial lift and shift of services that we had.
So Boops and I have been working on YouView's sort of journey into spend optimization and visibility across the organization. And I want to share a story of kind of typically how companies get to the place where they're starting to optimize their cloud spend. And it's probably a fairly typical one for you guys if you're gone down this journey. Out of curiosity, how many of you are like actively managing large amounts of cloud spend or trying to optimize right now? Like buying reserved instances? Yeah, right sizing? Distributing that to the teams? A few of you? Awesome, great. So this journey may look fairly familiar. So if you think about a journey here of basically cloud spend and dollars, because it's Amazon, or pounds if it was Azure, and time access here over time, you essentially start with where most people do, right? Some dev and test, where just getting the feet wet in cloud, whether it's a migration or net new that's being built. And typically at that stage, there's not a lot of controls around it. There's not a lot of process in place. Until we have what's called an involuntary load test, where someone spends up a lot more resources than they mean to. They leave them running over a weekend or maybe for a month before they get the bill, and suddenly there's a lot more focus on the whole cost side of things. So once that tends to get under, or once that's got under control, we see initial POCs go into place, a little more control around that, and then not long after, you get sort of the first apps hitting production, right? Individual workloads if you're migrating, net new apps if you're a tech startup. And in this area, people aren't really usually focused that much on the spend side or the cost management or visibility. They're really just kind of thinking about keeping everything running. They're high-fiving because they're in the cloud. Things are going well. And it kind of continues up like that as, in the case of a tech company like YouView, viewers increase and spend increase, or an enterprise where more adoption and migrations are happening, spend increases. And it hits this point eventually, though, where somebody like on the executive team or the management team starts really caring about the spending, right? And hits a threshold where there's a lot of focus on this, and suddenly it becomes more of a problem. So that's where we want to kind of pick up this conversation from where YouView started with this and the typical profile that happens when this happens. So when this occurs, people tend to start to look for a secret ingredient, right? Like, what can I do to get my cost optimization under control, to get things really managed? And the challenge that companies run into is that there's not really any secret ingredient. You just kind of have to put a better process in place. You've got to get a team in place who understands this, who gets educated on it. You've got to get metrics in place to track, your right-sizing percentages and your RI coverage and your elasticity, and really start to build a process around this. So starting kind of at the base of this, and we'll use this formula as a frame for the whole talk, which is your bill is made up of this. And it seems really simple, but it's an important concept to remember as you start to think about your spend optimization. So the spending is a combination of usage, that is, how many instances or buckets or RDS instances or volumes you're using, times the rate, right? So what are you paying for each of those, whether it's on demand or RIs or spot or anything else? And it's a really important concept because we're going to use both sides of this equation in different ways as we start to optimize them along the way. Now, when we're talking about the cost, though, the cost isn't always the cost. The cost is actually made up of a lot of different things. The cost that you're going to get out of AWS is a list price that often needs to be factored in with other things, right? So there may be customer discounted pricing. There may be custom allocations you need to do because it turns out that tagging structure you put in place doesn't actually align to the way you want to report on things. You're going to have to amortize reserved instances if you're buying them, as well as start to look at currency conversions, less of an issue in AWS, but if you're doing prepayments, taking pounds into dollars to pay for it ahead of time, you need to track that over time, and then of course taxes along the way.
So some of the things that AWS provide are things like consolidated billing. So this allows multiple accounts, but one bill. So this makes it much easier for the finance teams to look after, so they've only got one payment to make. And you can also benefit from tiered pricing. So with some of the services, the more you use, the cheaper the unit cost. So you start to share those lower unit costs across all the accounts, rather than having to start from scratch on every account. You also get another benefit with consolidated billing in RI utilization sharing. So you can purchase reservations. Joe's going to go into a bit more detail about what reservations are, and share them across multiple accounts, so you got less chance of wasting reservation. So,
and the structure we're going to kind of go through in this talk is I'm going to try and focus on some of the fundamentals of how these bits work, and Boops will kind of share how YouView does this. And this is a good example where essentially you have two tools to split up your spending, right? You've got linked accounts, which are part of that consolidated billing structure that he was talking about, and you've got tags. So tags are really flexible. You can apply 50 of them on a resource, do all kinds of things with them, change them over time, but they're hard to get good coverage on because you have to automate it and put policies in place against it. We see a lot of companies leaning into this linked account strategy, right? Which is, I need to charge back to a cost center, or I need to charge back to a product. Let's put an account in place for that. Ideally, you're doing a combination of these two, where you're essentially getting the most important breakdowns in linked accounts, and then tagging below that for the operational metrics or items that your team needs to understand for right-sizing other areas. But how do you guys do this? What's the combination?
So we've got a combination of both. So we've got a number of different environments which use different accounts, and then we've got a standardized tagging plan that we apply across all of those accounts, which then help get aggregated views of things like that. So here's a bit more about tags. So a lot of this is from AWS's tagging strategies. So you've got to pick and choose what works best for your organization. So within YouView, a lot of these technical tags are really useful to us. So we focus mainly around these. So we could do things such as when we have a new version of an application which includes performance enhancements, because we have the version number tagged, we can compare how much it costs to run the previous version compared to the new version. We also can use the tags to go across all the environments as well. So we deploy into multiple environments. So we've got a number of environments that YouView use internally, as well as some environments that we have to make available to content partners to test their applications and their metadata ingest against. So we leverage all those tags in Cost Explorer and Budget Alerts. So going on to those tools, and this is how we do the tagging. So we use a tool called Yeoman. So by using that, every time a new project is started up, a set of templates are created. So all the CloudFormation templates are ready for the developers, and they've got all the tags already set up against all those resources. By doing that, the devs don't need to think about tags. So they're there from the moment the templates are created, and they're propagated all the way through the environments through the CI/CD tooling. So they're easy to roll. There are a few disadvantages. So one of the problems is whenever AWS makes a service GA, they may not necessarily support tags from day one.
There's a tagging issue right here.
Tagging. So some services we have to retrospectively go through
I'll mess with it
and
when you
then
talk.
add those tags.
On the subject of tags, actually, if you've got a resource that's used by multiple departments, how do you manage costings across those departments for a single resource, for example?
So yeah, we do have a few instances of those. They're mainly data sources. So using microservices, we tend not to get too many dependencies.
Right.
But there are some that we have in terms of data stores, and we just need to be aware of which teams are sharing some of those resources.
And do you do that through tagging, or how do you do that?
Yeah, so the question was, do we do that through tagging? So YouView is a fairly small organization, so we've got a number of teams, and it's fairly clear to me which teams are using what resources. So by doing that, I know where the overlaps are. And again, yeah, it's very few instances that we have that, but there are some there.
Ideally, if you've got those shared resources, though, you're taking those as a group and then you're allocating them out based on some measure of how people are using them. So maybe there's 10 accounts that are using the resource or 10 tag different values, and you want to allocate it based on EC2 spend by a percentage or something like that. So you're reallocating it out.
Some more about how to view all the billing information. So most of the services in the console, they're in the main part of the console. Billing's a bit hidden away. You've got to go into the top right corner and get across to the billing dashboard. So within that billing dashboard, the first thing you see is an overview of what you spent last month, what you've spent so far this month, and a forecast of what you're going to do next month. Within the bills section, it is what it says. So it is they are the bills, and they go into quite a bit of detail. So even within our environment, which is in a single region, our monthly bill goes into tens of thousands of lines. And so if you're going across multiple regions, you get a full breakdown. You are able to also save those bills into S3, and there's a number of widely available articles about how to then ingest those into QuickSight to allow you to do analysis against those. So Cost Explorer is one of the key tools to understand where your usage is. So to really make the best use of Cost Explorer, you need to have your cost allocation tags enabled. So here are some real examples of YouView's tags. So one example here is we're showing the spend across different AWS services. And then probably more useful is the other one there, where we've got an example of how that usage is broken down amongst our various feature teams. So we can see what each feature team is using, and that's really useful for showback. So although we don't have internal chargeback within our organization, it's useful to understand how much each service costs to support. So whenever we get a request for a new feature from one of the content partners, we can then track that back to see what that's cost in terms of AWS resources. So part of my job is to also have the budgetary forecast. So trying to forecast in a very elastic world where things are changing all the time is really difficult. Make it even more difficult, the finance team want all the costs in accrued costs rather than the cash basis. So this has led to some really complicated spreadsheets where we're tracking reservations that are made, amortizing them over time. Also, being in the UK, we are a pound sterling company, so all our bills are in dollars. We've got to then convert that into pounds. And we also pre-buy our currency months in advance. So we lock in rates with the bank for 3 months. So we've got a rate for dollars for that time, and then the rest of the time, then we've got to then renegotiate another rate. One of the things that Amazon launched in January this year is the ability to show the amortized cost within Cost Explorer. So that is a big gain. Other things you need to also think about is discounts. So if you're part of the enterprise discount program, those discounts aren't shown initially when you do the reports in Cost Explorer. They're retrospectively applied. So every time I get the data out of Cost Explorer, I then need to include things like our ADP discounts. There are also some other services that you don't initially think of. So when you see the initial rate card, for example, for EC2, you just see the hourly cost of how much it will cost you to run that. So you think straightforward, yep, I'm going to have that multiplied by the number of hours. But then there are lots of associated costs with that. So data transfer, if you've got detailed metrics enabled, the monitoring, if you're logging out to CloudWatch logs, all of those costs start to become significant once you get to scale. So you just need to be aware of the additional cost rather than just the instance hour or the cost per gigabyte month.
So jumping back into this formula of the cost of usage and rate, what this essentially gives us is 2 different levers to pull, right? So you've got how much you're using, and you've got how much you're paying. So on one side, we want to avoid cost by using less, and the other side, we want to reduce rates by paying less. So we're going to talk about both of those, both fundamentally and how YouView does it. So in the first part, I always like to remind people, start with the biggest slices of the pie first, because it's really exciting to go look at your Lambda spend and try and optimize that, but it's probably pennies or dollars because it's so small. This is pulled from, we manage like 5 billion pounds of cloud spend, so this is like an aggregate view of AWS data. And not surprisingly, there's EC2 across all of that as, I think it was 65% or something. And there's EBS, which is an often forgotten area of optimization, but it's still a big chunk. I want to say it was in the 15-18%. RDS follows S3, and you'll notice things like Lambda and the more exciting services like that are kind of buried at the top here. So start with these chunks if you can. And the 3 steps to get going, really, it's first, terminate the things that are unused. It's surprising when you start to look at a cloud estate, how much stuff is just sitting there idle. So starting there is key. Next, getting to resizing things that are too big, and this is not just instances, it's EBS volumes that are too big, it's buckets that are infrequently accessed, it's a number of items. And then ideally automating that, so you're cleaning these things up on a schedule to be proactive instead of retroactive. So common areas of waste in the just turn things off area, EC2, clear, shut off the instances. I would say the biggest thing that I see people typically have problems with are their EBS volumes. So first, unused, unattached volumes that are sitting there and not doing anything that need to be snapshotted. And then once they're snapshotted, the snapshot's laying around for too long because the snapshot policy is creating too many of them, and then those need to be deleted. The next area is frequently S3 buckets, so it's easy to put stuff in there. It's a little harder to remember to delete it and to access when things are not being accessed frequently. And then RDS is a big one. So plain common sense, but high cost, low usage first. Get rid of those. So then we get into right sizing. And there's a little more nuance here, right? So first of all, critical thing, remember peaks, max, mins, all of that. A lot of people, when they go to do this, they look at sort of averages of what it's doing over time, which results in some really bad results for performance. If you get CPU clipping, which we'll talk about in a minute. The other thing is, don't just think about the instance family that you're in, right? Don't just think about, hey, I picked M4 because it was a good workhorse and it was going to do all kinds of things. It may be that I should be in a C, or I should be in R, or I should move to T2 because that's going to be better. And the third thing is consider that you've got some risk versus reward trade-offs. There may be times in production where you're willing to take a little less savings in order to make sure that you've got enough headroom for your resources, whereas in dev, you're willing to push a little closer. So look at multiple options there. When we talk about CPU peaking, or clipping rather, this is a classic example where you've got hopefully a spiky workload if you're elastic in some fashion. And the average here is actually about 38%. So if you did that right sizing based on that, you would hit these peaks and have really degraded performance. And then finally, automating the cleanup of these things. So best places to start, auto-scaling groups, shutting those down when they're not being utilized, scaling them down. EC2 instances in dev and test. Who knows how many hours there are in a week? 168. How many of those are nights and weekends? 108 of them are nights and weekends, right? So a big chunk of stuff that you can potentially shut down. And the snapshots, as we've talked about, getting rid of those. Those accumulate quickly, so automating as much as possible. Oh, I went backwards. I like that slide. Whoops.
Yep, so one of the tools that you can use to identify where to start is start to look for idle resources, etc. It's Trusted Advisor. So the cost optimization checks are only available to customers on the business support and enterprise support plans. So you only get the real benefits of it if you're on one of those. It is a really good place to start looking for the idle resources, the S3 buckets that haven't had any data movements. But the recommendations are very naive. So coming back to the clipping, here's another real example from our latest Trusted Advisor, where it recommended that we need to get rid of this instance here. So TV workloads are very spiky. So when EastEnders starts, for instance, it starts across the nation at the same time. And all those signals are synchronized by DTT signals across the UK. So within 3 or 4 seconds, you've got that program started across the whole nation. So we get very big spikes on the hour and generally at half hour as well. So the Trusted Advisor recommendations wouldn't consider that. Also here as well, the peak, so this is showing the peak CPU on the 1 minute granularity. It only goes up to 30%. So you could say that this is a wrong instance size and we could potentially go down to the smaller instance. But we've got that instance that size because of the networking. So we don't get enough of the bandwidth on the smaller instance, so we need to have instances that look underutilized.
All right, so we talked a little bit about avoiding costs when using less. So we're going to talk about reducing rates. And that basically means, okay, you've gotten rid of the unused stuff. Now how do we get the best possible price for the workloads? Falls into 4 categories. Typically on-demand, right, is the most expensive. Spot, which Blips is going to talk about here a bit in what YouView is doing. Reserved instances, which increasingly we're seeing large and small enterprises get to as high coverage rates as possible. And then you get those automatic tiered volume discounts as well. So let's talk about Spot.
So one of the things that J.R. mentioned is switching off your environments weekends and evenings if you're not using them. We can't really do that because we have all our content partners who have various support teams around the world working in different time zones, as well as having different requirements on weekend work, etc. So in September 2016, we had a real shock with our build. So they were just growing and growing, like the initial slides. Part of that was we were really focused on doing the replatforming work, the new services, and we sort of took our discipline, our discipline went out the window a bit. So there are lots of resources that were left running that didn't need to be running. And also the other big impact of that time is we had the Brexit vote, and the pound crashed against the dollar. So against our budget forecast, that made a big difference. So we were going into sort of, our budget wasn't looking very good. As part of doing the cleanup, so we had a big focus on cleaning up lots of things that were left running. And we also had to think about how we can change the non-production environments that we're using. We swapped a lot of those instances out to spot prices. So this table here shows the average prices that we've paid over the last 12 months. And on the M3 medium, those figures are actually based on about 3 million hours worth of usage. So you can see there the 83% saving against the on-demand cost is a huge saving. It does always obviously come with the risk that spot instances may be taken away. So we've had 3 times when instances have been taken away. And 2 of those times we blame the US elections. So one of them was around the time when Trump got nominated, so we think Cambridge Analytica was taking up all the instances. Another time again when the election results were coming through, again, is possibly financial institutions doing a load of number crunching, and they were paying 10 times the on-demand price for spot instances at the time.
So jumping over to the reserved instance side, because not all companies can do spot, and sometimes we see a combination of the two. You've got two components to RIs, right? So you've got a cost savings and you have a capacity reservation. I would say 80% of companies are really just focused on the cost savings, and probably even more than that really only need that. Capacity is important though, depending on spiky workloads or very specific instance types or dedicated instances, for example. Really important thing with reserved instances, may seem rudimentary, but it's important to remember they are coupons. They are actually not instances. There's no such thing as a reserved instance. There's only a coupon you can get that you can apply to an instance. It used to be that you get hourly coupons, but Amazon went to per second level billing. So now you've got 2.6 million coupons every month that can be applied to a resource. Now, not a specific resource, but any resource based on Amazon's choosing. It's non-deterministic within the estate. So what stayed the same recently with reserved instances? You have these two types. You've got standards and convertibles. You've also got various payment options, right? You can pay no upfront, which is like you commit for a time period but don't put any money down. You get a discount. You can pay partial upfront. You pay about half of it at once. You get a bigger discount. You pay all upfront, where you pay the whole 1 or 3 year term, and you get the biggest discount. Convertibles are a type that you can exchange for anything. So you can buy for an M4 large and EU West 1A, Linux, and then later change it to be an R3 in US West. There's regional benefit with RIs, which is a 2017 edition, I think, which lists you used to have to assign reserved instances to an AZ specifically. Now they can apply to a whole region, which makes it a lot more flexible. And critically, the thing to remember with RIs is don't forget to go beyond EC2. Just like we talked about the waste and cleanup, there's more areas in there. You can buy RIs for RDS, really similar use case. They're node-based, Elasticache commitments, Redshift, DynamoDB. So definitely look beyond EC2 as you're doing those recommendations. Some new stuff with reserved instances for those of you who haven't looked at them much in the last 6 months. Great new thing called instance size flexibility that says, hey, now, and I'll get into more detail on this in a minute, but it says it doesn't matter what size you run, as long as it's in the right family, we'll apply the RI against it, we being AWS. There's also now a new 1-year convertible RI, which is getting a lot of pickup, particularly from companies who have commitment phobia and want to just commit for a year and change to anything over time. Lowest discount rate, but really great for flexibility. You can now also split and merge convertible RIs, which is a new thing. So if you bought convertibles in the past, you used to have big chunks of them and you couldn't really combine them together. So that's a great new addition. And as mentioned, AWS went to per second billing, which if you are highly elastic, and actually I did a talk at reInvent in Vegas this last December with Atlassian, and Atlassian shared that they're so elastic that per second billing saved them tens of thousands a month. If you're not elastic and everything's running all the time, it didn't really change much for you, but it does make RI management more complex. So instance size flexibility, really important concept with reserved instances in that you used to have to buy for an 8x large or a 4x large or a 2x large. AWS introduced this great thing where you now buy based on units. So here you have units and example a bunch of larges that can apply into any of the sizes within here. Happily, they do this automatically now. It used to be something you had to do manually via modification. The important takeaway from this is if you really want to get the most out of your RI purchase, and by the way, this ISF only applies to Linux regional-based RIs. If you want to get the most out of it, you don't want to buy these sizes. You want to buy these sizes. You want to buy the smallest possible units so you can bin pack in all the bits to get the highest possible coverage. And definitely look at the convertible RIs if you haven't already. Best coverage rates, meaning you can change things all the time. You're not locked into any instance type. As things evolve and Amazon announces new types and price drops happen, you can always move them around. It does require a bit more management. It gives you a lot more flexibility. With RIs also, we mentioned you're not buying for a resource. You're not buying for an instance. So it's important to think about them in this waterline strategy approach, where you're essentially looking, and we're going to talk about in hours because it's easier than seconds, but each hour of the day, how many of a certain type of resource are you running at a certain frequency of the time in order to determine how many RIs to buy. So for example, if you wanted to buy RIs for 100% of your hours, in this case, you would buy 4 RIs. You basically have 4 hours of this period where 100% of the time there are resources running. If you want to get to a 90% coverage rate in this example, you would buy 5 RIs because there's a little time period in there in which there's not enough resources running. 6 RIs to get to 80, so on and so forth. The break-even point for RIs typically is like 40 or 50%, so you can get pretty high up there. The thing to note that's really important in this is at any time, you may have different resources running in the hour that change, right? And so the RIs, because they're non-deterministically applied coupons, might move around within this infrastructure. And also, it means that you don't necessarily have to buy all the RIs that you have instances for, right? Because if we bought for every single one up here, we'd be buying a lot more than what we actually need. Last thing on RIs we'll mention is the break-even point. People are really afraid to buy reserved instances because they have to commit to 1 year or 3 year. Am I going to be running that for that long? But it turns out most of the break-even points for reserved instances are much, much, much shorter. A 1 year break-even point is often as little as 4 to 6 months. And a big, scary 3 year RI will often break even in like 9 to 12 months. So once you've passed that point and gotten to this cost break-even point, you could actually stop using the resource and still have saved all the money on the back of that, or saved enough to make it make sense. In talking a little bit about the process of this, for usage and rate and all of these, we definitely recommend getting a cloud economist or an RISR like Boops, who can focus on reviewing the billing data to really get the best savings out of the infrastructure. It's pretty compelling in the sense of you can save 30% on your bill typically just by doing some decent RI coverage. So it pays for, I think it pays for you, Boops, doesn't it?
Pays for themselves, yeah.
Yeah. Pretty quickly. It's typically somebody who understands both finance and tech because they need to go between the infrastructure teams and the finance teams, the procurement teams to understand the cost of capital and how we're going to deploy it and what infrastructure to buy against. And important to factor in that custom pricing as well when you're making those decisions. And through that, you want to focus on really iterating quickly through a loop, right? You have somebody like Boops who's going to get in there, run the data because your infrastructure is changing all the time, and you need your reserved instances to move around with those to make sure you've got the right coverage. So use a buy, measure, learn approach where you're buying, measuring the results, iterating on that, and ideally getting to a really regular cadence where your RIs are staying aligned to your infrastructure and you're getting the most savings. So let's talk about how YouView does it.
So a bit about how YouView does the RI buying purchase. So it's my job to just go around to various teams, understand what the plans are. So we have some of the product roadmaps that the tech teams are aware of. Using that, try and get an idea of what sort of resources that means. So built up very complicated spreadsheets in the past, which detail every single resource that those teams are expected to run over the time, and use that for the forecasting, and then we track that. So it's reviewed at least every quarter. So every quarter we have a true up to see how we did against the forecast, and as part of that we're then projecting again through to the rest of the financial year. So that data is used to make all the RI purchases, renewals and modifications. So for instance, the C5 class, we're using a lot of C4. C5 is cheaper and it gives more resources. So as the previous C4 reservations came to an end, we decided not to renew those, and we modified those into C5 and got the teams to change their instances. So all of those are reviewed very regularly, and the purchases are made depending on our financial cycles as well. So depending on how many dollars the finance team have got allocated for the month. So we may hold off some purchases sometimes, we may bring forward purchases. And we try to target 70 to 80% of our on-demand resources, of our resources to be running with a reservation. So we have a fairly well-defined baseline, and we're quite aware of the bulk of our peaks as well. So most of it fits in with TV viewing profiles. So in the evenings we see our peaks and troughs, and throughout the rest of the day it's normally a bit quieter, changes a bit during holidays, especially when the kids are around. One thing to be aware of when purchasing RIs is make sure you buy the right type. So a few years ago, I was looking at renewals, and we mainly run Linux instances. So we had some Linux instances coming to an end. We were going to repurchase those. Then we had a look at it in a bit more depth. We're actually running Red Hat Linux, and those reservations weren't being applied. So we had wasted RIs as well as paying on demand for that cost. We eventually got a bit of, after a bit of negotiation, we got some of that back from AWS.
Yeah, that double whammy can be really painful, especially when you're bringing your own license. A couple things I wanted to add to this. So here's that waterline in effect, right? So you've got your current RIs versus what you need, and those peaks and troughs above that are what you don't want to reserve. The targets, the estimates are really important. It's defining metrics on these things, not just for RI coverage, but for elasticity, for right sizing. Ideally, you don't want to chase all the teams all the times about optimizing all the things. And so if you have targets defined, and metrics need targets, not just tracking what they are, you know when to lean into those teams and say, okay, you've broken through this threshold. We want to give you tools and help along the way. So last kind of some takeaway notes we'll leave you guys with, and we can jump right into the questions. I know we're probably a little late on time. But ideally, you centralize that RI management so that you can take advantage of the economy of scale. You have all those instances going up and down to get the best possible amount, and decentralize out to the teams the right size and the using less, because they know the resources they're running, what they can do with them. Ideally, you got to aim for 100% cost allocation. It's really hard to get there, but getting that tagging strategy nailed early on, getting the linked account strategy working, combining things together ideally so that you're needing potentially to say linked accounts and tags into one group so you can allocate out to the teams. Automate as much as possible. Creating that feedback loop is really important so teams can see what they're spending, which again requires allocation to be in place before you get there. Otherwise, they're looking at the wrong spend data. And ideally, you start to gamify this process, right? So you have teams who are looking at each other's spend. You have an executive level view that can see how teams are comparing scorecarding and benchmarking and efficiency against each other to really create this culture of cost management. Because everybody loves the technology and loves clicking the buttons to spend up new resources, but this is a different set of muscles and a different discipline that the organization has to develop. So that is what we have today. So we have a little bit of time for questions. Thank you. And EJS